The family and kinship are created when parents have children, and in most societies around the world, that's only supposed to happen after potential co-parents are married. Marriage is one of the fundamental institutions of society, a basic way that individuals are tied together into a social network. But it's also one of the more variable aspects of culture, so that much energy has been devoted to understanding and explaining marriage and its role in culture. Let's start with the central definition. The text gives a definition of a union between a man and a woman such that children born to the woman are recognized as legitimate offspring of both partners. You'll notice that the citation for that quote comes from a 1951 publication, and even in 1951, most anthropologists would have been rather uncomfortable with it. A pair bond for the purposes of raising children is certainly part of what marriage is, but marriage is also much more than that. So it's appropriate that as soon as the text quotes that definition, it abandons it. Here's my definition. Marriage is a social, economic, and sexual union, expected at its creation to be permanent, that creates reciprocal rights and obligations between the partners and any of the partners' children. With a definition like this, the institution of marriage is effectively universal. All societies around the world practice marriage among most of their population. A few subcultures might abandon marriage. The Nair of India, for example, where what passes for marriage really isn't an important relationship. But for the most part, marriage is something that everyone is at least eligible for. The reasons that marriage is so widespread are not entirely clear. Universals beg for explanations, however, and one fairly convincing theory is that marriage has evolved in response to the demands of child-rearing. In this explanation, marriage is an evolved arrangement that increases the likelihood of both parents' offspring surviving until the offspring reach maturity. By forming a partnership where the parents of a newborn child pool their resources and both contribute to its care, the child's chances of survival are greatly increased. Marriage allows for at least one parent to be present at all times to care for the child, while the other present is out gathering food. From an evolutionary standpoint, both parents benefit from the arrangement as well by having a way to offload child care duties when it's necessary for their own self-preservation. On the other hand, we must be very careful to understand that origins are not necessarily related to functions. Today, marriage is about much more than biological reproduction. Many married couples are childless, either by choice or due to infertility, but they're nevertheless married. And in some marriages, spouses work to raise their partner's offspring rather than their own, what we would call stepchildren. So, while it makes sense to say that marriage first appeared due to evolutionary demands of reproduction, culture has made it much more than that. So the most basic question about marriage is, whom do you marry? How do you choose a partner? This is the meat of marriage studies and how marriage works to establish social relationships. First and foremost, one never marries someone in his or her immediate family. With a very few notable exceptions, this is a universal, called the Universal Incest Taboo. Your book does an excellent job of discussing how incest is culturally constructed. In the interest of time, I won't duplicate most of that discussion, but you will be expected to know the material for the exam. Aside from the incest taboo, there are two basic principles that determine how people choose marriage partners. The first and most common is exogamy. Exo, meaning outside, and gamos, meaning marriage. So marriage outside the group. An exogamous group is one where two members of the group are prohibited from marrying one another. So, from the incest taboo, families are universally exogamous groups. In fact, descent groups are almost always exogamous because all members are recognized as kin to one another. In such cases, the incest taboo is extended to all recognized kin, but only to recognized kin. To see how this conflicts with our sense of kinship, let's look at cross-cousin marriage. As we discussed last time, kin terms lump or split genealogical relationships based on the significance of the social relationships one is expected to have with those kin. Our English system uses one term, cousin, for many distant relatives outside of our direct line of descent. The closest genealogical relatives to whom we give the label cousin are first cousins. If ego calls alter first cousin, alter refers to ego with the same term. The parents of first cousins are siblings, and first cousins share grandparents in common. With our bilateral system, we don't distinguish between mother's and father's sides of the family, and we don't distinguish the gender of the cousin. So, in genealogical terms, first cousin means parents, siblings, child. In the Western bilateral system, all first cousins are generally considered to be covered by the incest taboo. On the other hand, parents, siblings, child actually refers to 8 specific genealogical relationships. Mother's brother's daughter, mother's brother's son, mother's sister's daughter, mother's sister's son, father's brother's daughter, father's brother's son, father's sister's daughter, father's sister's son. Note that these abbreviations use Z to represent sister because S was already taken by son. In an exogamous unilineal system, 4 of those relationships are necessarily of a different lineage from ego. Father's sister's son, father's sister's daughter, mother's brother's son, and mother's brother's daughter can never be of the same lineage because ego's parent's gender, the F or M, is different from ego's parent's sibling's gender, the B or Z. On the other hand, if the siblings are of the same gender, father's brother's son, father's brother's daughter, mother's sister's son, mother's sister's daughter, there's a good chance that the cousin will belong to ego's lineage. It will happen automatically for 2 of these cousins, father's brother's son and father's brother's daughter for a patrilineal system, and mother's sister's son and mother's sister's daughter for a matrilineal system. And it may happen for the other 2 as well. The kind of first cousin that can't ever belong to ego's lineage are called cross cousins, the children of siblings of different genders. The second kind that may belong to the same lineage as ego are called parallel cousins, the children of siblings of the same gender. If the incest taboo extends to recognized kin that belong to the same lineage, then cross cousins are not covered. A cross cousin of the opposite gender, in fact, is the closest genealogical relative likely to be available for marriage when ego is in search of a spouse. The cross cousin's family is also well known to ego's extended family, and there's already a marriage alliance between the 2 groups. It makes sense to reinforce that relationship by ego wedding his or her cross cousin. A cross-cousin marriage is the ideal spouse, the spouse that mom and dad dream of when their children are still infants. In point of fact, even in societies that allow cross-cousin marriage, most actual marriages are not of this sort. Perhaps no cross-cousin of the appropriate gender can be found, or maybe cross-cousins are already married, or maybe they just can't stand to be in the same room as one another and refuse to marry. But again, if such a marriage could work at all, it's considered the ideal pairing. Parallel cousins, on the other hand, are probably of the same lineage, so they're often seen as unsuitable marriage partners for ego. Such a marriage would be considered incestuous. Even though the genealogical or genetic relationship is exactly the same, parents, siblings, child, one type of cousin is a sought-after spouse, and the other match is considered disgusting. Thus, culture governs marriage patterns, not biology. If a person is required to marry a partner from within his or her own group, this is called endogamy. Endo means inside, and gamos, again, means marriage. So, marriage inside the group. Explicit rules of endogamy are relatively rare, but the members of some social groups almost always seek spouses of the same group, even when they're not required to. Some scholars, Kotak included, use the term homogamy for this optional but common practice. Social classes are often endogamous. One must marry according to his station. Religious communities are also usually endogamous. Witness JDate, the dating website specifically for the Jewish community. Ethnic and racial groups, which we'll study soon, are also usually endogamous. Cross-cousin marriage would seem to violate our Western principles of incest, so it seems odd to us. Similarly odd-seeming practices are Levirate and Sororate. In Levirate, a man must marry the widow of his brother. In Sororate, a woman must marry her sister's widower. In both of these practices, we see one marriage relationship ending through the death of one spouse, and another marriage with the same family being created right away. The relationships would change like this. Here we have a man and his brother. One man marries a wife of another lineage. They have a child, who in this patrilineal society belongs to its father's lineage. Then the father/husband dies, which breaks the marriage bond. This leaves the child disconnected from his or her lineage, and the widow probably homeless as well, since she was probably living in her husband's patrilocal household. To solve these problems, she marries her former brother-in-law, which reconnects the fatherless children to their lineage and provides the widow a reason to continue living in the same household. Of course, for sororate, you just switch triangles for circles and vice versa. Why practice levirate or sororate? In many cultures around the world, marriage is less a relationship between two individuals and more an alliance between two lineages or extended families. When a spouse dies, the alliance can remain intact by replacing the spouse with an analogous member of the lineage. That explanation emphasizes the role of marriage in creating affinal kinship, kin relationships that are formed through marriage, what we might call in-law relationships. The kinds of kinship we discussed in the last lecture are called consanguineal kin because they're based on shared blood. In most societies, both kinds of kinship are very important. Thus far, we've been talking about marriage relationships between individuals. A marriage relationship is always a union between individuals, but some societies allow at least one of those individuals to have more than one marriage union at a time. That is, marriage is a union between husband and wife, but the husband may have more than one wife, or vice versa. First, however, let's look at the simplest case: one husband, one wife, and no one else. This is called monogamy. Mono, one, marriage. So, one marriage partner. Our own society practices, at least in theory, monogamy. A husband and wife are married, forsaking all others until death do they part. In practice, our society actually practices serial monogamy, where individuals may have a series of monogamous marriages throughout their lifetime, but only one at any given time. The alternative to monogamy is polygamy, many marriage partners. In societies that allow polygamy, one gender is limited to only one partner at a given time, but the other gender is allowed to have multiple marriage partners. The more common form of polygamy is polygyny. Poly, meaning many, and gynos, meaning woman, so many wives. In a polygynous society, a single man may have several wives simultaneously. Cross-culturally, polygyny is allowed in most cultures, though most actual marriages tend to be monogamous. Why should polygyny be allowed in most cultures? There are several basic theories, but no single theory seems to explain every polygynous culture. One that seems to apply in many places around the world is a surplus of marriageable women in the society. This can happen when men are disproportionately killed off through warfare, or when men are prohibited from marrying until much later than women. In either case, there will be more women seeking husbands than men seeking wives, and the logical result is polygyny. While Westerners are likely to view polygyny as exploitative and misogynistic, in this case, the benefits accrue to the women. They get sexual access to husbands who can father and care for their children. In a monogamous society, such a gender imbalance would result in many unwed and childless women. Much less common than polygyny, in fact almost non-existent, is the practice of polyandry, one wife with several husbands. The scarcity of polyandrous societies may be due to the sexual competition it encourages between co-husbands. Fraternal polyandry, where brothers marry the same woman, lessens the competition.
Amar and Kundan are brothers. Now in their 40s, they have lived together almost their entire lives in the hills of Himachal Pradesh. They share just about everything: their work, their home, and a wife.
Tell me about your wedding day.
We have a simple wedding, Kundan says. There is a bride and a groom, and the younger brother is simply attached to the elder brother. And this is their wife, Indira Devi. The trio have worked side by side as husbands and wife for more than 25 years. It's been going on for ages. My sister-in-law has 2 husbands. My mother-in-law also has 2 husbands, she says. It's called fraternal polyandry, where the brothers of one family are all married to the same woman. It's not common in most of India, but still flourishes in remote parts of the Himalayas.
There are about 200 families in this steep hillside village that function pretty much the same, although some wives have 3 or 4 husbands, depending on how many brothers there are.
Typically, the marriages are arranged.
What about love? Do you love both of these husbands equally, or was this just for tradition?
I like both of them. I look at them the same. When I am troubled, I tell them to marry someone else. But they won't. What they do want is children with their shared wife.
This is a bit embarrassing, but how do you deal with sex at night?
That we have to work out. We make shifts, change shifts, and sleep on alternate days, or else it won't work.
Is it difficult to have to share a wife between the 2 of you?
To run the families, we have to do this, overcome the hurdles, and we have to control our hearts from feeling too much also. But feelings grow, and so did their family. They have 3 adult children now, who all live and work together in the same house.
Do you know which child belongs to which biological father?
We tell the kids that both fathers are the same. The family doesn't know and doesn't care. The daily grind takes all their time and energy. There is no room for vehicles here, so everything is carried by head and hand. Life is simple. And most villagers do hard labor on their tiny plots of inherited land. Younger brother Amar breaks stones for a living in his backyard and at a mine. His wife does back-breaking work in the fields, careful not to step on snakes.
In this difficult terrain with few jobs available and very little land to share, one of the reasons that polyandry is popular here is because of pure economics.
The practice goes back centuries because land is so scarce in this hill country. If Amar and Kundan had taken separate wives, they might have had to split the family's little land. So they stick to tradition.
Do you want this tradition to continue with your 3 children?
I feel it is good for my daughter to have 2 husbands, she says. If they marry like that, they will be happy in the future. Her 17-year-old daughter isn't so sure about that.
How many husbands would you like? 1, 2, or 3? Team.
I would like 1 husband, she says. But in this remote corner of India, Sunita Pundir knows she is bound by custom.
Will you marry for love or you will marry for tradition?
I will marry for both, for tradition as well as for love. I will never leave our tradition, even if I have to forego love. I will never spoil my parents' reputation and my brother's. Sunita's 2 brothers have already decided they will follow tradition and share a wife.
Family marriage joint system.
My opinion is that in a family there should be a joint system, he says. The joint system is very good. Family runs very well that way. To find one, they'll have to travel to another village. The gene pool here is too small. The villagers say almost everyone here is related in some way. There's another incentive for polyandry. For every 1,000 boys born in this region, there are about 850 girls. As education and India's rapid modernization seep into this hill country, though, its ancient traditions may fade away. Until then, life for these villagers will be much the same as it was for their forefathers and mothers hundreds of years ago. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Himachal Pradesh, India.
So polyandry is probably a response to very limited resources. Rather than dividing resources among several households, men pool their resources, including the resource of wife, to increase everyone's chances. Let's start talking about the cultural customs surrounding marriage. Ceremonies of marriage are unique in every society, so not much can be said of them in a general lecture like this. But marriage is both social and economic in nature, and it's the economic aspects of marriage that have received the most attention from anthropologists. Virtually all marriages begin with economic transactions between the two families. Traditionally, the most common economic transaction in the West has been the dowry. A dowry is a gift given to the groom or his family by the family of the bride. Sometimes this gift is understood to be theoretically given to the bride herself. Theoretically, it will serve as a means of social insurance. If the new husband turns out to be incapable of supporting his wife, the dowry can be used. Of course, the husband is often in charge of family finances, so he gains de facto rights to spending the dowry wealth. Other dowry societies are more explicit in making the gift to the groom's family. Such societies are usually strongly patriarchal, and the dowry is seen as compensating the woman's new in-laws for taking her in and supporting her. In the U.S., we no longer practice dowry payments explicitly, but the practice has evolved into the tradition that the bride's parents pay for the wedding. This substantial payment on the part of the parents frees up substantial cash that the newlywed couple would otherwise have to spend, amounting to almost the same thing. The other, more common form of marriage gift goes the other way, from the groom or his family to the family of the bride. Kautak, for reasons I can't really fathom, calls this lobola, using a particular native term from Africa. Far, far more common in the literature is the term bride price or bride wealth. The transfer of wealth to the bride's family is understood to purchase the bride's labor from her family. In most cultures that practice bride price, this loss of labor can have a very real impact, since in most of those cultures, women, especially young, fit women, contribute greatly to subsistence. It also serves to demonstrate the groom's suitability as a spouse. He and his family have the resources to gather and then give away a substantial amount of wealth, and he's devoted enough to the bride to give up that wealth. In other words, if the groom can pay the bride price to his future father-in-law, Daddy's little princess will be well taken care of. Those are exchanges that take place surrounding the beginning of a marriage. What happens when a marriage ends? In all cases I know of, when a marriage is initiated, the intent is for it to be a permanent relationship between the spouses and their respective kin. Nowhere is there an expiration clause in the marriage agreement. However, we know, of course, that not all marriages are successful, and some do end in divorce. Different cultures think about divorce in radically different ways. In some, it is simply impossible. If the couple stops living together as spouses, the marriage remains legal and binding. They may enter into informal arrangements with other partners, but those partners can never become spouses in any official capacity. In some parts of classical India, even the death of a husband was not enough to break the marriage bond. Widows were expected to commit sati, ritual suicide, at their husbands' deaths. In other societies, marriages can be broken by a refund of the dowry or bride price and a public declaration that the union is now void. Where divorce is most common, it tends to be associated with very prominent economic and social roles for women. Strongly patriarchal societies tend to prohibit divorce, even when the husband wants one. On the other hand, in matrifocal societies such as the Minangkabau of Indonesia, women have strong economic bases of their own, separate from their husbands, and men have conflicting responsibilities that make marriage stressful. More than half of all marriages will end in divorce. The United States' attitudes towards divorce have changed radically in the last several decades. At the beginning of the 20th century, divorce was possible but extremely difficult, and it carried a terrible social stigma. Serial monogamy existed, but because a high death rate created many widows and widowers, not because there were many divorces. Today, the U.S. has one of the highest divorce rates in the world. This change might be seen as the result of several factors. The increasing participation of women in the U.S. economy has given them greater economic independence, much as matrilineal has done for Minangkabau women. Also, the greater secularization of American society has lessened some of the religious objections to divorce that dominated past generations' thinking on the issue. Residence of married couples is also neo-local, and affinal kin and extended kin are relatively unimportant. All these factors combine to make divorce less disruptive outside the immediate nuclear family. Thus, more people are willing to take advantage of divorce to end unsatisfying marriages. To wrap things up, it should be obvious that marriage is an important component of society. It determines how kinship groups are connected through affinal ties. It determines the makeup of households and even the members of nuclear families. When combined with kinship and gender, those three social institutions define most of our important social relationships and the basic shapes of our daily lives.